The most powerful weapon in the world right now might not be a missile, a fighter jet, or even a nuclear bomb. It might be money, and not just any money. Trillions of dollars quietly sitting inside the sovereign wealth funds of 4 countries in the Persian Gulf. For decades, those funds have flowed into the United States like a river, buying skyscrapers, funding tech companies, backing private equity, financing infrastructure, and holding enormous positions in American markets. But tonight, a question is starting to circulate in financial and diplomatic circles that could reshape the global economy. What happens if that river suddenly changes direction? What happens if the Gulf stops investing in America? And even more importantly, what happens if those trillions start flowing somewhere else? Because if that shift ever happens, it would not just be a financial story. It would be one of the largest geopolitical power shifts of the 21st century. To understand why, you first have to understand who actually controls the money. The countries at the center of this conversation are Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait. Individually, each of these countries is wealthy, but together they control some of the most powerful financial institutions on earth. The sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf collectively manage trillions of dollars in assets. These funds were originally created to invest oil revenue for future generations, but over the past 2 decades, they have evolved into something far bigger. They have become global financial kingmakers. The Saudi Public Investment Fund has poured money into American technology, sports, and infrastructure. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority quietly holds positions across global markets that span real estate, equities, and sovereign debt. The Qatar Investment Authority has stakes in major Western companies and financial institutions. And the Kuwait Investment Authority is one of the oldest sovereign wealth funds in the world. These are not passive investors. When they move money, markets move. When they change strategy, entire sectors feel it. And for years, one destination has consistently absorbed a huge share of that capital, the United States. From Silicon Valley startups to Manhattan skyscrapers, from private equity giants to infrastructure funds, Gulf capital is woven deeply into the American economic system. It is quiet, often invisible, but incredibly powerful, which is why a potential shift in that capital flow would send shockwaves far beyond Wall Street. Because this relationship between Washington and the Gulf was never only about money. It was built on a much older foundation: security. For decades, the United States has provided military protection for Gulf states. American naval fleets patrol the region. American air bases dot the Gulf landscape. Missile defense systems shield critical infrastructure. In return, Gulf states have remained closely aligned with Washington economically and strategically. It has been one of the most stable alliances in modern geopolitics. But alliances are built on expectations, and expectations can break, especially when economic costs begin to pile up. The Gulf economies today are not the same as they were 30 years ago. These countries are no longer just oil exporters. They have spent the last 2 decades transforming themselves into global business hubs. Dubai became one of the busiest aviation hubs in the world. Doha positioned itself as a center for energy, trade, and diplomacy. Abu Dhabi expanded into finance, technology, and sovereign investment. Saudi Arabia launched enormous economic transformation plans under its Vision 2030 strategy. All of these strategies rely on one critical ingredient: stability. International companies move their headquarters to cities they believe will remain safe and predictable. Investors deploy billions only when they believe the environment will remain secure. Tourists travel when they feel comfortable visiting. The modern Gulf economic model depends on this perception, but regional conflict threatens that perception. Even the possibility of instability can ripple through aviation routes, investment flows, and corporate decisions. And this is where the financial dimension becomes extremely important, because Gulf states are not powerless observers of global politics. They control something that many countries desperately need: capital. In a world where governments are carrying enormous debt loads and corporations constantly seek investment, capital is influence. The United States, despite being the world's largest economy, still relies heavily on international investors purchasing assets, financing projects, and supporting markets. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are among those investors. Their capital supports everything from venture capital ecosystems to real estate development, which means their investment decisions are never purely financial. They are strategic. If Gulf states ever decide to redirect even a portion of their capital flows away from the United States, the consequences would ripple through financial markets in subtle but powerful ways. Treasury demand could shift. Infrastructure projects could lose funding. Private equity deals might look elsewhere for backing. But perhaps the most important consequence would not be economic. It would be symbolic, because capital flows are also signals. When sovereign funds choose where to invest, they are effectively voting on the future. They are signaling which economies they trust, which partnerships they prioritize, which alliances they believe will remain stable for decades. For decades, the Gulf has signaled trust in the United States. But global power dynamics are changing, and one country in particular is watching this situation very carefully. China. China's economic relationship with the Middle East has expanded dramatically over the past 15 years. China is one of the largest buyers of Gulf oil. Chinese infrastructure companies are deeply involved in regional projects. Trade between China and Gulf states has surged, and Beijing has been quietly strengthening financial relationships across the region. From currency swaps to investment partnerships, China has made it clear that it sees the Middle East as a critical piece of its long-term global strategy. If Gulf capital ever begins shifting away from the United States, China would be one of the most obvious destinations, not necessarily replacing the U.S. overnight, but slowly absorbing more of those flows. And in geopolitics, slow shifts often matter more than dramatic ones. A gradual reorientation of investment over 10 or 20 years could reshape global economic influence, which brings us back to the present moment. Right now, Gulf governments face a complex balancing act. On one side, they remain deeply connected to the United States through security arrangements and decades of cooperation. On the other side, their economies are increasingly globalized and diversified. They trade with Europe, they invest in Asia, they supply energy to China and India. They host multinational companies from every continent. Their future prosperity depends on maintaining stability across all of these relationships, which means their strategic decisions are no longer simple. They are no longer choosing between allies and adversaries. They are choosing between economic risks and economic opportunities. And that is what makes capital such a powerful tool. Military alliances are public, financial leverage is quiet, money can move without headlines, investment strategies can change without formal announcements, and sometimes the most important geopolitical signals appear not in speeches but in balance sheets. If sovereign funds begin gradually shifting where they deploy capital, the world may not notice immediately. There will be no dramatic press conference, no official declaration, just small adjustments, a little less investment here, a little more investment there. Over time, those adjustments accumulate. They reshape markets, they influence partnerships, they redefine alliances, and that is why this story matters. Because behind the headlines about military tensions and diplomatic negotiations lies a much deeper question. Where will the money go? In the 21st century, economic gravity is one of the most powerful forces in geopolitics. Countries with capital shape the future by deciding where that capital flows. They build industries, they finance infrastructure, they accelerate technological ecosystems, or they slow them down. The Gulf sovereign wealth funds are among the largest pools of mobile capital in the world. Their investment decisions influence sectors from artificial intelligence to renewable energy. And as global power competition intensifies between the United States and China, those decisions are becoming more strategic than ever. Because whoever attracts the next generation of global capital will shape the next generation of global influence. So when analysts talk about the possibility of Gulf investment shifting away from the United States, they are not just discussing finance. They are discussing the architecture of the global economy. The question is not whether alliances will disappear. They won't, but alliances evolve, economic partnerships evolve, and the flow of capital evolves with them. Right now, the United States remains the dominant destination for global investment. Its markets are deep, its institutions are powerful, its economy remains the largest in the world, but in an era of rising geopolitical competition, no economic relationship can be taken for granted, not even one that has lasted for decades. The Gulf states understand this. They are positioning themselves not just as energy exporters, but as global financial players. Their sovereign funds are becoming instruments of national strategy. And in the years ahead, the decisions made inside those investment committees may quietly shape the balance of global power. Because in the modern world, the most decisive battles are often fought not with weapons, but with capital. And sometimes the biggest shift in power begins with a simple decision: where to invest next.